What's up, everyone? Aaron Nagler here with Cheesehead TV. I am joined by a very special guest, Mr. Pete Dougherty, my former colleague at PackersNews.com, columnist for the Green Bay Press-Gazette. Pete, how the hell are you?
Doing well, Aaron, and we still miss you over there. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. You know, I'll be there in the vicinity in I guess a week now. So, I think we got to start with the news that broke on I guess about an hour ago here on Tuesday afternoon regarding the Big Ten moving their season back to the spring. Obviously, we just talked to Brian Gutekunst about the possibility of this happening, college football in general. Who knows? It sounds like some conferences may play, some may push, some may cancel altogether. What do you think this means for Brian, the personnel staff, and how do they go about even beginning to scout some of these kids if they don't have tape to look at going into the draft, which you have to presume the NFL is not going to move?
Yeah, it's going to be it'll be tough. Some of these guys, of course, they have, as Brian said yesterday, they have 2019 tape on.
Right.
You can watch their college tape from last year, but guys improve. And what about the guys who only played part-time last year, but then end up playing full-time this year and having great seasons and could be pretty high picks? That's not at all uncommon, especially with guys leaving early. They have a really good year, and it's like, well, I'm going to the NFL. I'm going to get drafted high, and they won't get the chance to show that. The one thing I would say is I'm not so sure they wouldn't move the draft if need be.
You think so? You think they'd be open to that?
I only say that because I was talking with an agent a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about why he thought they'll get the season in. He said he thought if they needed to, they could play the Super Bowl in March if they needed to. He also
Right.
One of the things he mentioned was that they can move the draft back to the summer if need be. So I think in these really strange times, they might be open to almost anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, don't doubt that that's the malleable kind of nature of everything going on around sports in general probably does kind of feed into that and that possibility. Let's kick it over to this team, the Packers in 2020. We've had now a week of Zoom availabilities. We're slowly creeping towards the Packers actually getting on a practice field on Saturday. What have you made of all this? I mean, there's been a lot of, obviously kind of hurry up and wait with the COVID testing, and then kind of the trickling of we've had access to guys, and we're not going to have access to the locker room this year, and we're not going to be able to be in the media auditorium, but we have had these Zoom availabilities. What have you made of it so far? It's been so odd, but it doesn't feel like training camp because obviously, A, they're not on the field, and B, there's nothing going on around Lambeau other than these guys coming and going.
No.
Has it been weird for you too?
No, incredibly weird, just coming and, working out of home all day long, not going over there. It's going to be so odd going to a training camp practice and the fans there and, the bikes and all that and just that whole vibe. That'll be really strange. I was thinking about this. The one thing I was trying to kind of run the numbers in my head. They're probably going to have at least as many, probably more real full practices.
I was thinking the same thing.
Where they're going ones-on-ones, starters against starters, all that, because really after the first –
they have no time.
After the first 2 weeks of training camp, a normal camp, they're getting ready for preseason games too. So they're mixing in evaluating stuff and running their own stuff against their own stuff, and also working off cards, getting ready for the preseason game. Now, McCarthy would spend the week before each preseason game, he spent a huge majority of the week working game plan stuff for the preseason game, knowing that he wanted to get looks of certain players and all that. LeFleur did a little less of that last year because he was installing his new scheme, but now they won't have any games to get ready for. So what is it, 15? How many practices?
I think it's 15. Like 15 or it's around that. I know it's around that. It's not a lot.
Weren't they always having, it was usually around 20, 21, 22 practices in camp?
Roughly, yeah.
And, many of those, a good 7 or 8 or 9 of them at least were a majority of it was devoted to getting ready for a preseason game. So now they're not going to have any of that. So they are at least going to be able to run a lot of their stuff, and they're just going to have to, work on, doing more scrimmage type stuff and putting guys in more competitive situations, like, how LeFleur did it last year, where all of a sudden they just run a quick period of it's, 4 downs to score from the 8-yard line,
right.
something like that. We'll probably just see a lot more of that.
It was funny. It's funny you mentioned the cards in the preseason games, because I remember last year they didn't get to cards until way later than, like you said, when Mike did it, they were out early. And the other thing with LeFleur is how little they were on the practice field. When you compared it to what Mike did, Mike would have at least 1 3-hour practice every summer and a bunch of practices that went, 2+, etc. I don't think LeFleur had them out there for more than 90 minutes one time last summer. I mean, I could be remembering that wrong.
I remember, Rob, our friend Rob Demosky was really good at keeping track of the
always.
And because McCarthy would have the really long one, and he'd have several practices over 2.5 hours. And I think the average for him was like 220 or something, like by the end of camp, if you average it out, it was at least 220. 220 was LeFleur's longest practice last year. And I think his average was like 155 or 205. It was really short. It was amazing. And, they had a lot of luck on injuries last year, but I've got to think that approach to practice was a factor.
And that's what I was going to ask. I mean, I remember talking to you. I remember talking to Rob and Ryan last summer about this very subject and saying, because we were not flabbergasted, but it was a big change. Yeah. And I just remember talking about it and saying, okay, well, the proof is going to be in the pudding. This is clearly about, okay, get what work we need done, but don't overtax their legs, like looking out for injury, etc. And as you said, they weren't susceptible to injuries last year. Now, obviously, some of that is luck. Some of that is just how, the things fall in the game of football. But you can't deny that they, for the most part, were one of the healthier teams in the league last year.
I think this was probably, and the numbers, it's really hard to quantify this because it's not just the number of players you lose, but it's also who you lose and for how long.
And for how long, right?
But just kind of going by my feel for having, I started covering in 93, the best injury seasons they had, fewest injuries. I remember in 96, Super Bowl winning year.
Right.
They lost, if I remember right, they might not have lost a defensive start, or maybe they lost like one defensive start in one game until Kuntz blew out his knee in the playoff game against San Francisco.
Right.
That was just ridiculously injury-free. In 14, they go to.
I was going to mention 14. That was the last time I think they've been this healthy. Right.
They had they had all 53 available for the NFC Championship game in Seattle. And then last year, those are the 3 healthiest seasons out of 28 or whatever that is that I can remember.
But even then, it's funny you mentioned 96, because as healthy as they were on defense, you flip it around on offense, they were literally scraping the bottom of the barrel and looking for guys off the street to go get Rison, for God's sakes, because they were so banged up at one position.
Yeah, Brooks tore up his knee halfway through the year, a horrible injury. Yeah, you're right. That was only one side of the ball too, so very, very true.
But it's so, bringing it back to LeFleur, how much do you think, given what we know from last summer, but coupled with the urgency to get these guys ready for week 1 in Minnesota, do you think he pushes it a little bit more this year? Because, I mean, they don't have preseason games. You don't want them coming out there and I guess without any kind of real contact, but you can't go to the ground in practice. That's not going to happen. How physical do you expect it to be?
I could be all wet here. We won't find out till we see him on the field.
Right.
I think he's going to stick with, I would guess he'll stick with this approach. And, they'll have a little more of that scrimmage stuff, but I still think he'll try to get him on and off the field as much as, as quick as he can. I think the rules even limit their practices. I think at first they can only go for like an hour and a half the first couple.
Right. Yeah. There's a timing.
I still think, I could be wrong, but I still think he's going to go. I still think he's going to go with less is more. And I don't know. We'll find out over the next month. fluid in his mind too, depending on how he feels like the team's health is and whether they're getting enough done.
Well, he keeps talking too. He keeps saying every time we meet with him, I think today may have been the first time he didn't, how fluid things are, how they're working it out as they go. And it's funny, you look around the league, there are other teams that have practice schedules all set. They're public. And the other thing I noticed is lots of other teams have footage, photographs, video of teams in walkthroughs and blah, blah. Green Bay has been completely buttoned up. There's no schedule. There are no pictures of Aaron Rodgers on the field. There are no pictures or video of practice at all. And they're doing walkthroughs. They're doing these things. Do you think that's LeFleur? Do you think that's Murphy? Who do you think is behind, like, okay, let's keep our cards as close to the vest as possible?
My guess would be that's the general manager, and that's a vestige of his mentor. That would be my guess.
Coming down? Yeah, that's probably true. That's a good point.
That'd be my best guess.
Yeah, I would agree there. Okay, I'm talking to Pete Dougherty here, talking football, talking Packers. Pete, you're a legend for joining me. I got a few more questions for you. Okay, so you're a columnist. You're paid to give your opinion, so I want your opinion. Guy who has covered the team since '93. You've seen it all. You've been through the wars. You went through the Great War, the Favre Wars of 2008. So I want your expert opinion here. Are people absolutely losing their minds in the complete wrong way about this Jordan Love pick? Because to me, when it happened, it seemed really obvious that, okay, this is their guy. They're going to groom him. And then at some point, they're going to have to jettison Aaron Rodgers. I think that seems very, very clear. But everyone seems to be mystified by this pick. Were you absolutely shocked / surprised, or did it kind of make sense to you when it happened?
It very much made sense to me. I didn't know whether they liked Love enough to pick him. And
right.
The scouts I talked to leading up to the draft, I just couldn't convince myself to make the prediction that they would take him.
Right.
But no, that position is everything in this league. You got to have a quarterback. And if you really like a guy and your starter's 36 or 37, yeah, of course they pull the trigger a year, maybe 2 years early, possibly. But these guys are so hard to find. You get your shot at the guy. They must, if you really like him, have the courage of your convictions, take him.
Go get him, right? Yeah.
And sure, they could have drafted somebody at another position, and that's an opportunity lost. You could also argue, go and look through their list of first-round picks for the last 20 years, 10 years, whatever time frame you want. There's a lot of guys who ended up just really not helping the team all that much at all. So if, Love doesn't play for 3 years or 2 years, that may not cost them that much. And even if he busts, they could have busted at another position too. So I personally, and you'll find people around the league, scouts and assistant coaches, there are some who are mystified at it, why they would do it. But I'm not. I thought if you really like him, I say take him.
Makes a world of sense to me. Finally, on the defensive side of the ball, I know a lot has been talked about the run defense. Obviously, the meltdown in San Francisco is fueling a lot of that. I know we've heard from Mike and we've heard from Kenny Clark. We've heard some guys talk about, there were stretches where we were I won't say dominant against the run, but we were okay against the run. How much is this going to haunt Pettine this year? Because they didn't do a lot in the offseason to augment their run defense. Now, I know Trayvon Hester's been brought in. They're undoubtedly counting on guys like Kingsley Keke to develop. But is this, like, if teams continue to run all over Mike Pettine's defense, is he out the door?
Yeah, I would think. I was a little surprised. They had a conference call. They had a Zoom call with Pettine, and I was on vacation, so I didn't see the conference call, but I read the quotes.
Right.
And did you see it?
Yeah, I think I was on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I asked him about playing so much dime.
Yeah, and I think so. It may have been the answer to that question. Even he basically, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sure came across from the transcript that he's said that he's not really going to change.
That's the feeling I got.
That's the feeling I got. Like,
Which
yeah.
I don't.
Which, I get it. It's a passing game, and you got to have a passing defense.
And you don't want to overreact to one game. But that's my point. Like, they keep framing it as we had our worst game at the worst time. Yeah, but there are a lot of other teams who ran all over you.
Oh yeah, Philadelphia. There was a bunch
Philadelphia, absolutely.
Denver
And I
almost
think
came back and won.
if you watch, it's so funny to me. If you watch that San Francisco game, you can look at the concepts that Philly used, and you can see Kyle Shanahan's wheels turning and going, "Oh, I can use that. I can do this. I can pull this guard out on the edge and like completely erase whoever's out there." It wasn't that mysterious. It was just effective, and Pettin had no recourse and no ability to adjust and stop it. And that's why I'm like, Brian didn't bring in a ton of help, so it's got to be on Mike to change, right?
I think so. And, you know, from if I understand it right, and I talked extensively about this with an assistant coach for another team, and he said he worked on a staff that had some of Pettin's guys from Cleveland on it. And they told him they just did not practice run fits very diligently. They just want their linemen to disrupt and their linebackers to clean up. And if you have great talent in your front seven, if you have dominant talent, that'll work fine. That'll work great. I mean, go back and look at the Jets stats. They had years where they had really good run defenses, but they had a ton of talent on defense.
Exactly.
And like his guy mentioned, like Pete Carroll, from what he's seen, Pete Carroll's about the best in the league at teaching the run fits and being really diligent. And if they do this, then everybody's run fit changes like this, like they go over all those details. And it sounds like, you know, Pettin's just, that's not their thing. And it is a passing league. You got to be able to rush the passer and you got to be able to cover and all that. But if you just completely neglect the run, as we found out, you got no chance. I mean, that game was over in the second quarter.
Pretty much. I mean, it's the old adage, right? You get what you emphasize.
No, sure.
Essentially.
So I'll be curious to see if you really, like, if they really don't change much, or if, you know, I mean, they brought in Jerry Gray, who's a defensive backs coach, so I don't know what his expertise is in the run, but he was a coordinator, so maybe he's going to help them a little bit there. Maybe that was part of the thinking, but I'll be really curious to see if they play the run better because, you know, San Francisco's not going away, and you're going to run into somebody who's a good team who can also run the ball, and you're going to lose that game if you can't play the run.
Couldn't agree more. There you go. From Pete Dougherty, the Green Bay Press-Gazette. Pete, thanks so much for joining me, man.
Oh, thanks for having me, Aaron.